Hey, good evening, everybody. John Henry Soto here. Welcome to Music Makers. It's Tuesday night, and I am here as always with Break Time, making a lot of noise in the background there. Let's meet Break Time here. Hold on one second. And there we go.
Hey,
All right, welcome.
everybody!
All right, so everyone, things look a lot different for this Music Makers.
Yes, it
It's
does.
Yeah, so basically, just so audience knows,
Amazing.
just anybody out there, had a little technical difficulties, didn't have a show yesterday for certain reasons. Technical was one of them, and my internet's getting fixed. Right now I'm on my cell phone, so hopefully this will actually get us through this episode of Music Makers. And of course, the guys are in the studio and they're hanging out there, playing some music, and been doing. We're really excited to see them. They're kind of doing their thing, what they do. This is Music Makers, and we haven't really played music, so I'm actually excited that you guys are actually holding instruments. It's actually
Yeah, for once.
people are starting to wonder, do they really even play music? They just talk.
Yeah. What do they
But
sound like?
yeah, so we're going to be talking about music from the 50s today. We've been doing 20s, 30s, 40s, and now today 50s, and it's been a real learning experience for us. When I think of the 50s, I only think of one guy, which is, the guy, Elvis, obviously, because
Sun
his impact.
Records.
What was that? And
From
Sun
Sun
Records.
Records.
Yeah, exactly. And because, I mean, his impact in on the world, whether people say he's not there's always this thing about the king of rock and roll, and there's always this, some people are like, he's not the king of rock and roll, that kind of stuff. They like Little Richard and those guys. But for me, when Elvis came on the scene, it was something completely different. It was it was the energy that he had, the humility that he had as well. His roots in the gospel music, all these things were such an important part of why I think, in my opinion, he was such a huge influence, because he came with so much sincerity. You know what I mean? And even though he got a lot of flack when he went on these TV shows and stuff, in particularly, I think it was it wasn't I know it was Ed Sullivan had to block him, but the first one where he went on where he didn't get blocked, it was then all the outrage and all the stuff. But one thing that was really true, that showed his integrity and how much people actually revered him as a person, was the fact that how many people came to support him. You know what I mean? Like how many, like Frank Sinatra was just like this. He's good. He's a good boy. I remember Ed Sullivan saying that. He was like, this is he's a good boy. He's entertainer. He's a very fine young man. And I thought that was actually really cool that they came out and they defended him, during the whole backlash of moving his hips and all that stuff. So for me, it's really difficult to even think of. I know that there was a jam packed after Elvis came out. The whole thing kind of like just really evolved, and even during that time, and even before that time, there was stuff happening. I think Elvis just kind of took it to another level and made it really, really mainstream, and made people actually take notice of something that had been already happening. With what's that guy, the Comets?
Bill Haley.
Yeah, and the Comets. That was earlier, right? And he was really, people talk about him as being like the founder of rock and roll, and the guy, one of the first guys. And you could kind of make that argument as far as the sound is concerned. But when a rock and roll star, it's kind of like, what rock and roll became, I would just have to say with Elvis and stuff. So anyway, I just wanted to open up with that, just because I know that he's the one that probably people have talked about the most in the history of music. Since that, I mean, I can't imagine any other artist that people, maybe Michael Jackson or something, that people just have so much to say about. But Elvis really, and of course the Beatles, but that's as a unit. But I would say, let's talk about the Beatles. I'm kidding.
Hey, John. No spoilers. That's next one.
That's next one.
Oh, okay. So anyway, that was my little spiel. So you guys are all in the same room. I'm gonna let Sean divvy you guys up and see who's next.
All right. So, how about we go to you, Tommy?
Oh boy.
Now, this is your specialty here. What is this decade all about, my friend?
The 50s, my friends, is mostly about rock and roll. This is like where it kind of really kicked off. And of course, like you said, Elvis was the guy that really put it into high gear and got it going and inspired many other artists into the 60s, 70s, and further on. But there are also other artists in this time period. Of course, you had Bill Haley, around that same time. You also had guys like Eddie Cochran coming out with 20 Fight Rock and Summertime Blues, which are still, especially Summertime Blues, it's a very, very popular song still to this day, and the other one too. And of course, you still had Frank Sinatra in there, non-rock and roll stuff too. You had Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin. You had all these different artists from rock to like pretty much everything, but obviously rock is the big one. And
you cannot forget Johnny Cash.
And of course, Johnny Cash,
Jerry Lee Lewis,
Chubby Checker,
or Carl Perkins. Now, if you put the four of them together, Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, in any order that you wish, all at one time or another signed to the Sun Records label.
Yep.
You get yourself the $1 Million Quartet.
Oh my God.
People, artists under that one label that many people have said, if you combine their output and the money that they've made, it's at least $1 million. It's at least $1 million. But now it's over millions, today due to inflation. Plus, their careers only started at Sun Records.
Right.
And, we
Isn't
have to
there
talk
that
about Sun Studio.
wonderful? Isn't there that wonderful photo of all four of them like sitting on a piano?
I was in that room and I sat at that piano. I actually saw the actual burnt-in cigar stain on the lowest E on the piano.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, last year in August, right after Elvis Week ended, I went to Sun Studio. I went to Memphis. So
wow. That's
Sun
on my
Studio,
bucket list for sure.
Founded by Sam Phillips in 1951. Many people call it the birthplace of rock and roll, and rightfully so, because it recorded, at the time known as the Memphis Recording Service, Sam recorded Ike Turner's Rockets 88, which many people view as the first rock and roll song ever. Yeah. And we just talked about the session from 1956 with Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis. It was a session, actually, that Carl Perkins had Jerry Lee Lewis in on, and he didn't even break out yet. Jerry Lee Lewis was just playing the session. He was just a regular old session musician at the time. He was laying a piano track on the song Matchbox, which is a great song that BreakTime covers. It's an awesome tune that the Beatles even covered, but that's the 60s. Again, no spoilers. Johnny Cash happens to walk in with his girlfriend, and they were just sitting in on the session. And as chance had it, Elvis, who was signed to RCA already because his contract was sold for $35,000, he shows up as well. And then that picture was taken, and there's rumors that whoever was the session engineer let the tape run and there's some tape out there of the $1 Million Quartet session. That's December 4th of 1956.
Jeez,
now,
whoever has that is a billionaire.
It's priceless. We gotta break down Sun Records because and Sun Studio. Sun Studio is America's studio, in my opinion.
Yeah. Because
it set into motion basically all the culture that inspired the British invasion, the punk era, new wave. It all went back to the 50s and the songs that were made in Sun Studio. First by Elvis with That's All Right Mama in 1954, played 14 times over 1 hour. Baby Let's Play House in 55, I Got a Woman by Ray Charles, and Trying to Get to You, a song that was originally sung by Roy Orbison, both in 54, and Mystery Train in 54. All these songs are 1-4-5, as we call them in the biz. And the 1-4-5 progression is known as the blues progression. And I know somebody who loves his blues progressions, and that's Tommy.
Are we sure it's me?
Now, Tommy, can you demonstrate a 1-4-5 and just yell out the chords as you play them as the 1, the 4, and the 5?
I'll give it a shot, my friend. I'll give it a shot. Hopefully this doesn't sound bad on the other end. But so this it's going to be the 1 part first.
So
starting with the 1.
We'll do it at a slow tempo, like a slow blues tempo. Go to the 5.
And then repeats or whatever it wants to go to.
Now,
usually repeats.
Now, the case with That's All Right, Mama, that's one of the songs, and Matchbox is another one of the songs where Sam Phillips, Elvis, and Carl Perkins really invented rock and roll, or rockabilly. We'll say rockabilly, because they sped the tempo up. Imagine speeding the tempo up on a 1-4-5. You don't have to.
Yeah.
Andres, how about you play? Oh, that's right. Okay, Tommy, you play a 1-4-5.
A little faster.
Sped up 1-4-5.
So, we'll do it in A this time because,
Nice.
Didn't do the 5, but the 5 is optional. Some people don't play the 5. You know, there's an E and an A, and then there's a B7, or there's an A, a D, and an E7. But
there's different ways.
There's different ways. It's always the 1, the 4, and the 5, and that's really what a lot of those are the important chords, both in just basic harmony and in a rockabilly. Played in any structure you want. You could change that structure around. You know, it could be 1 for 1 bar and then go to a 4 and then go back to the 1 and all that good stuff. But that's where rock and roll was invented.
Yeah.
Where it started.
So thank you, Sam Phillips. Thank you, Elvis. Thank you, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, who I must contend was the most successful under the Sun Records label. Carl Perkins doesn't get his due.
Oh yeah.
He's the person who wrote Blue Suede Shoes, Matchbox, Honey Don't. Everybody's trying to be my baby. Movie Mag is a lesser known one, but all these tunes, Elvis covered Blue Suede Shoes. The Beatles, they covered Matchbox and Honey Don't. And Eric Clapton, Johnny Cash, and others also did their own versions of these songs. And he made a ton of sales for Sun Records, but he always doesn't get his due. So thank you, Carl Perkins. You're the man.
Him. Hopefully he gets his royalties, though.
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
I hope he does. Jeez, so many songs.
I
just want to go back a little bit and talk about Johnny Cash because I love Johnny Cash. When people think of rock and roll, they don't immediately say Johnny Cash, but they don't realize how much rock and roll he was. And, just his style of music and his vocal. I mean, he was a person he was an artist unlike no other artist up to that point and since. Whereas I can look at Elvis, and even though I think Elvis's impact was great, you can look at him and say that other artists have done what he did, going on stage and doing that kind of sensibility in the music. But Johnny Cash was just somebody who nobody really can just go up there and do like another Johnny Cash. You know, they can't just be. He just was not possible. You know, it was like he was just this whole entity that was of his own.
The Man in Black.
Yeah, the Man in Black, and
and what a rich voice! What a rich voice he had.
Yeah, it's just his voice and just his writing was just so emotional. So his last album, I don't know if you guys have heard his last album, but his last album was just gut wrenching. It was just, I mean, he knew the end was near by writing these songs and putting these words to paper. And when I first heard the thing, I was like bawling at some of these tracks. It was just so amazing. But just going back again, you had said something. What were we just talking? Oh, we're talking about the Man in Black, and that was actually just he had a guy who was making suits for him. He called the guy up and he said, I need some suits for I'm going on tour and stuff. And he said, well, what colors do you want? He goes, yeah, but just send me whatever colors you want. And he goes, all right. So the guy sends him like 10 black suits. So Johnny Cash calls him up and he's like, yeah, I got the suits. He's like, but they're all black. And he's like, yeah. He goes, well, and he tells the story actually, the tailor. And he's like, yeah. He goes, well, I always kind of like thought of you as like a dark figure, like the Man in Black. I just kind of always thought. And it was like, all right, well, keep him coming. And he just hung up, and that was it. And from that moment on, he became the Man in Black. So it wasn't his, but he did have that personality where he went through a hell of a lot growing up. I mean, prison and crime and all that stuff was just part of his life. And then he played all those prisons and those great prison albums and stuff. I mean, just amazing. I mean, so I mean, when you look at like rock and roll, he was to me rock and roll. You know what I mean? Like just the epitome of it, as far as like the talent, the lifestyle. Which unfortunately, I know it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that whole cliche or whatever at this point has become a thing, or is a thing. But although I don't think it's a thing as much as it was, but at that time it was just this very, very free way of living. And because when you're successful, money flows. There's people around that have drugs, and I think it just kind of like got all. Of course, women gravitate towards musicians. I think that all kind of just fell into place, and somebody must have coined it at some point: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I don't know. Maybe we can research that actually when we get a little bit.
Yeah, we'll actually talk about that in the 60s.
Yeah,
I have a ton of stories of that one.
Exactly. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about Johnny Cash a little bit on that. So anyway,
Johnny Cash, he was a sincere man of faith, and he definitely he took a lot of like interesting like viewpoints when he wrote songs. Like he put a lot of different like things into different perspectives when he wrote his songs. And it was very, like you said, it was very heartfelt and authentic.
Well, he was very conscientious of what was happening in the world, and even though he wasn't tremendously outspoken, he was in his music. But I don't know if you guys remember Pete Seeger, who was in the Weavers early on, and he became kind of a political figure, and he would go out and sing these political songs. All these classic political songs that or not even political songs, but they were just songs that were very aware of what was happening in the world and stuff. And some of them, and he got very into politics, and he was called a communist, and he was banned from a lot of shows. Pete Seeger was, and Johnny Cash was one of the ones that actually invited him to his show and said, I want you to come to my show. That's Elvis. But he can't do a Johnny Cash impersonation. So he asked him. He said, you should come to the show, and he did. He came on, and the response was incredible. And he sat with them with guitars, and they talked about some of these songs and what they meant to them individually. And I thought it was very, 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 very good. Hold on one second. I'm getting some.
You got some live comments.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
So
you can see them. The actual video was real emotional. His last. Oh yeah. Oh man. Yeah, he's talking about Johnny Cash's last video. Man, when you see Johnny Cash's face and he's delivering those lines, it's just like boom. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm telling you, when I heard the album, it was just one track after the other. I was just like, it was almost like he took everyone down this memory lane of his whole life in this one album. And his last song, that video that Thomas is talking about, was very very emotional. You know,
Yeah,
That's
So,
the cover, right? The Nine Inch Nails cover.
Which one?
Hurt.
Was it her? I can't remember.
Yeah,
I've heard
Hurt.
that song, but I don't know if that's the one that. That's the one he's talking
That's
about.
one. That's the one he filmed in like his old the Elvis Museum. That was all run down at that point.
which one, from his last album?
Oh, not Elvis Museum. The Johnny Cash Museum. I don't know if it was his last album, but he recorded it 2 years before he died.
Yeah, that was from his last album. Yeah.
Yeah. Hurt. Yeah, the Nine Inch Nails cover, I think.
Yeah. Oh man. Yes.
So John, I picked up on something that you were talking about. I liked when you brought the political aspect of this up. So when you mentioned he's a communist, we're actually in we're talking about the right decade to bring this up, because McCarthyism did happen from 1950 to 1954 mainly, where people were, very, very suspicious of, communists, and, there was a big Red Scare going on, in the United States.
Yeah,
but there was a lot more going on.
Yeah.
It was all in all a prosperous decade, because there was worldwide recovery going on from World War II. September 8th of 1951, Harry Truman signed the Treaty of San Francisco with Japan, ending World War II officially. October of 1951, Winston Churchill assumes power as the Prime Minister of Great Britain after World War II. Queen Elizabeth II assumed the throne on February 6th of 1952. Stalin died on March 5th of 1953. May 17th, I think this is 54, the Supreme Court ruled segregation illegal. July 17th of 1955, Disneyland Park was opened up, as well as Ray Kroc. He founded the first McDonald's franchise, and now that's the one of the richest and most prolific businesses anywhere. Like McDonald's like can count as an American embassy at this point, because it's everywhere. 1956 we'll come back to, because that's a very important year. October 4th of 1957, Sputnik was launched into space, starting the space race. July 29th of 1958, Eisenhower established NASA. January 1st of 1959, Fidel Castro assumes power in Cuba and brings communism, which is still something they are struggling with today.
Destroyed that place.
And July 24th of that year, the kitchen debate, which was one of the famous conversations between Vice President Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev, who was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, occurred. And November 16th of 1959, The Sound of Music debuts on Broadway. And it had 1,443 shows, if I believe, if I'm correct, all the way up to the 90s. I think it was all the way up to the 90s, if I read correctly. So, it was a very great decade.
What a decade.
Huge, changes going on politically and culturally. There was a lot of manufacturing in the United States, homegrown manufacturing and home construction, baby boomers, the good old baby boomers.
Okay, boomer. It was a very, it was a very prosperous decade too. It
was a walking decade.
One of those decades where America was just on top of the world, because we were building. People were the war was over. There was, I got it. Um, there was a, the economy was strong. People were working. It was just a really good time for America. And of course, when we have such a prosperous time, all that stuff is spills out into the into everyone else's psyche, and Elvis and all these beautiful people just came out and created this amazing music wave, as well as even some politicians did actually some good things, which is wild.
Yeah. Now,
I
John.
was all sarcastic.
With the prosperous decade, there obviously has to be some more technological innovations. As opposed to what happened in the 40s, there was not much going on as per. There was not a lot going on in the 30s as per Andres.
Yeah.
So now, what was going on in the 50s, my friend?
Well, there was a good amount of innovations being made. Probably the most important ones were the start of computer technology. Even though it wouldn't even resemble a computer today, things like the modem were created, and the coding languages were created, which is what would be used to start making more computer software in the future. And also, the RCA made the synthesizer, the music synthesizer, which kind of laid down the groundwork for electronic music in the future. Without them, there'd be no EDM raves. So we've got to be thankful for that.
So not all was good. I'm just kidding.
We got to talk about the television too.
Yeah, we had color television.
Color television debut.
And also the video, like the handheld, well, not handheld, but the video camera was created for commercial use. You could buy one and start making home videos. And just to go back to the music, one thing we didn't mention was jazz. The 50s was a big decade for jazz. That's when you had Miles Davis making his debut. Blue, Kind of Blue was released in the 50s, which featured John Coltrane, who would make Giant Steps in 59. You had Thelonious Monk was in his prime in the 50s. And that was the whole, because in the 40s was the whole, bebop jazz, really fast, kind of big bands, whereas Miles Davis created cool jazz with his quintet, and that kind of changed the whole trajectory of jazz. And in that decade, there was like multiple subgenres of jazz created, and that's when a lot of records were released that had songs that are still being, learned today by jazz students. Dave Brubeck released the album that had Take 5 and Blue Rondo a la Turk, which were like some monumental jazz songs. But yeah, as far as technological advancements, there was some pretty important ones. Fiber optics was also created, or optic fibers, they called it back then, which is what we use now to.
Shout out to Verizon Finance.
Yeah, shout out to Verizon to fix your internet tomorrow.
Andres, can you play some jazz? I turned your amp on.
I'm not plugged in.
You're not plugged in. He's not plugged in.
I turned your amp on.
Some technical difficulties.
Some technical difficulties, but we shall get Andres's.
Call Verizon.
Yes, we'll call
Hey,
Verizon.
Verizon, can you help Andres plug in, please? Thank you.
Yeah, to invent the fiber optic amplifier.
Cheesy over here, music lady.
All right.
All right, we're back. We're good. There's always some jazz on. We're talking about jazz right now.
Yeah.
Hey, I was doing a walking bass line to fill the time.
So
Anyway, he's back.
Kind of Blue had the tune "So What," which is like one of the most cool jazz sounding. Like when you want to ask when you ask someone, "Hey, what's cool jazz?" You just tell them. Oh. So it also was when we had modal jazz. It's cool jazz / modal jazz, which is all like some intense music theory stuff going on. And that's just, to me, as a music theory nerd, I love getting into the modal jazz.
And now modal jazz.
Yes.
Give us a layman's description of modal jazz.
Okay, so the most simple way I can explain it is you have, when you try to describe the emotion of a chord, or a scale, you have your major scale, then you have your minor scale, and then that's only 2 scales, but in reality there's many more. So your C major scale, that's one mode, but then you could do, which is your D Dorian, which is a mode, because there's chords that correspond with the scale degrees or the notes in the scale, and then you can share those around between modes from other scales. So when you have it going from that's really focusing on E minor to D minor, but then all of a sudden it goes up a half step to F minor and E flat minor, and then you can just do some really weird stuff, and it's the more you learn about it, it's like a rabbit hole. You start getting into it, and music theory is fun.
Yeah, you can really get in your own head when it comes to this stuff. Like for songwriters, since we're songwriting, if we make it that difficult, then it is fun to theorize about it, but execution is harder.
Yeah.
Right, especially executing it where it communicates, because I think that's where it gets a little difficult, and probably one of the reasons why it's so, like Andre said, the rabbit hole. When you go down theory and you get into really because it's languages, so it's like you're saying there's like maybe 12 to 13 different languages and then within those languages there's languages, and you can actually put those languages together and take words from here, take words from there, and it becomes this other thing. And that, when you get into that rabbit hole and you start actually messing around, you can get so involved in it that it will be a communication to you, and you would understand what you're conveying, right? But unfortunately, because the ears of society is more on the pentatonic scale for everything that's out on the radio, they don't fully address that. This is one of the reasons why I talk about the fact that I go to a jazz club and I see some of the greatest I've seen in my life. I've seen the greatest musicians on earth about a foot away from me, where I paid about $15 to see, and I had to go see Santana, who's all pentatonic scale, very, very creative, but it's all just very simple. Not simple, I don't want to say simple, but you know what I mean. It's just a scale that we all can identify with, right? And I had to pay, hundreds of dollars to go see him. So the communication sometimes is where, and it's good that you explained it, because I think it will give people a little bit more of appreciation for it, and maybe in the future they'll tend to listen to it a little bit differently. We should probably do something like that in the future, where we really break down a couple of things just to give people an understanding of why it even exists. You know what I mean? Like why is this such a popular thing? And jazz is incredibly popular. I mean, all over the world. I mean, it's really, really popular.
There's major, there's minor, there's melodic minor, there's what other minor, harmonic minor.
There's a lot of stuff in there.
You gotta count to 7, for each scale, for each, like, based on whatever scale, and then you have to go relative to whatever this and this and this, and
right.
It's
because there's only 7 notes, right, and in between them there's like other stuff. And
Mhm.
so it's like there's just
It's all up to the artist. It's
all
great
up to
that the
yeah,
artist,
exactly right.
somebody's
Exactly.
interpretation, is going to be different than somebody else's, which makes
Right.
our music, when we extend our humanity onto it,
Right.
so how Andres plays that scale might be different to how Tommy uses that scale.
Correct.
And
that's what makes it exciting.
Style, and it's fun. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what makes it. And there's no. I think every note or every piece. Maybe not, but there's always differences. It's like in film, right? Like people say, well, all stories have been told. Well, not really. You know what I mean? I think maybe there's probably like a lot of major stories that have been told, but told differently is where it gets interesting. And it's the same thing with music. You can do the same scale, the blues scale, but how you actually hit that blues scale, the way I do it is going to be different than Tommy, it's going to be different than Andres, and that's what makes it exciting, and that's why music is so freaking the best thing on earth.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so but that's cool. Thank you, Andre. I appreciate it. Was there more? I'm sorry. I know we went off on a musical
I just found a
education.
way to get back. I just found a way to get back to it. So speaking of modes, and speaking of scales, which is the same thing anyway. Let's go to the Mixolydian mode. Also, it's basically when you add the flat 7. When you play a major scale and you play the 7th note and you flat it, it's very similar to the pentatonic scale, but pentatonic 5, 6 notes depending on which notes you're counting. So one of the pioneers of that, I would say, is Chuck Berry, and his style of playing 2 strings. His 2-string playing, he was the best 2-string player probably ever.
Double stops.
So,
Great.
Tommy, I think we need you to play probably the most famous riff of all time.
The riff that everybody
and
should
the
have.
one that
under
I've
their
heard. Yeah, the one that I've heard referred to me a lot of times. Growing up, I mean.
And you've probably heard us do it a couple times in the past, maybe. But anyway, it goes a little something like this. It's a blues riff in B, by the way. Let me try that again.
Nice. Yeah,
We have
I mean,
about Chuck Berry. Without a Chuck Berry,
Rock and roll wouldn't exist.
yeah, John Lennon said it
That's
best.
from, that's from Back to the Future, right?
Yeah.
If we gave rock and roll another name, it would be Chuck Berry. That's what John Lennon said.
Quintessential rock and roll right there, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes it's unfair to say because I'm talking about Elvis and stuff. As far as like individual impact, but musical impact, you know what I mean? It's different. So you look at someone like Chuck Berry or even Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, also was like tremendous impact. But when you look at these guys, each one of them had such a tremendous impact in different areas of the same exact thing. It's sort of like a corporation where you have the great accountant and you have the great sales team, and they just provide this one great business. They took rock and roll, and within that rock and roll, they were experts in their field of whatever that was within that thing. I think Elvis was the presenter of, the guy that just presented this energy and this thing, right? And then when you get into technical stuff, you got Chuck Berry doing stuff that was like just revolutionary. Not to mention the fact that he's dancing around the stage while doing it. So he had both sides of like the presentation and the technical part of it. And then you got guys like Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, phenomenal. He was the whole package too. Rock and roll presentation, jumping, playing with his feet, all that stuff. Was just an incredible energy as well.
Pianos.
Yeah, so you can't really. It's not fair, to say that, that one particular. It is true that rock and roll was kind of like happened in the 50s. You know what I mean? I mean that's when it really became a thing. And then all the religious. Sean, let's talk a little bit about that because that was an interesting time period. If you've researched that, where a lot of religious organizations came out against rock and roll, saying that it was music from the devil, and there's all this footage of. There's this one particular scene that I remember, which you probably have seen if you're because you've watched probably a lot of stuff. But it's a black and white scene with this young guy, and he's like preaching, and he's like, "Rock and roll is evil because I know how it makes you feel. It makes you feel evil, and we need to stop rock and roll." So there's this long speech that this guy's giving, and I guess in his church, and watching it now is absurd to us, but watching it then, it must have swayed a lot of people, which I'm sure it did, to really say, "Oh my God, this is evil." This is, not really understanding what was happening. The creative process. Do you have anything on that?
Well, I will say I did not see that scene, but I did see a scene at a church with. It was in the Buddy Holly story. Shout out to Gary Busey for his portrayal of Buddy Holly.
Great movie.
Yeah,
great portrayal too.
Yeah, and it's exactly what you're talking about. Buddy is sitting down, prim and proper in church, just after playing a gig at a rink or whatever, and the preacher is railing against it, and you see him shrinking in his seat. He's trying to make an artistic statement, but he's just shrinking in his seat at the the rabid disapproval of what's transpiring and what's going to take over the world. What we know now as rock and roll, compared to the music today. If people could see into the future, that's just a cakewalk. What they were listening to. So
that's another that is another interesting thing, because you could also make the argument, and just to play devil's advocate, no pun intended, but you could also make the argument that because of rock and roll, the music we have today is the way it is. So people can say, well, that's what happens. It gets worse and worse. And it's not true. I know it's not true. It's just that, certain entities, people that were in control of the music industry, made certain decisions that were not based, not with the greatest interest of the artist. It was just what they thought, or even their own aberrated, weird minds wanted to put something out that was really did not make sense. So the music that we have now, which I hope that this whole pandemic situation makes people actually look at stuff a little bit more with another glance, and look at it and be like,
back to sincerity. Let's get back to love. I love these guys.
Yeah,
and,
right. Because the sincerity is so right. The sincerity of some of this music, and I'm not talking about hip hop as a whole. I'm not talking about R&B. I'm not talking about any particular music. I'm talking about music that just purposely says things to degrade another human being in any way. So if you're degrading women, if you're degrading a minority, if you're degrading man or woman, if you're just degrading anything, the music to me is not worth my time, because that's not what music is about. Music is about uplifting people and making them feel good. You can talk about subjects that are touchy, but you have to be creative in it. You have to use metaphors and do something creative. You don't have to be so blatantly disgusting, and that to me is like shows no creativity whatsoever. Like cursing for me is like I mean, I'm not saying I'm a saint. I curse, I mean, I'm not even talking about the actual words, what I mean. I'm saying the intention, right? Because you can have people that don't curse at all, but their intentions are still not good. And you have somebody who curses but it has good intentions. So to me, it's not that part of it, but it really is a very disturbing the last 10 years of music have been very disturbing to me. And I'm glad I didn't play that much during it, because it would be frustrating to try to get my band to have played in the last 10 years. I think moving forward, it's going to be a lot easier.
Yeah,
Sorry, I went on a tangent there.
I do agree with you, John, 100%. I think that there has been an obsession with like rebelliousness, like always being like in vogue, and especially it's been in vogue the last 10 years. But
yeah, unnecessarily.
It's gone way too far, and everybody's trying to do this, and it's just making it more and more uncool, and it's kind of weared out its welcome.
Yeah, and my last thing that I'm going to say, and I'm sorry, I just want to say this one last thing, but the rebellious thing, it makes sense in the 60s. There were reasons to be rebellious. That we had this Vietnam War we shouldn't have been in. There was just so much other crap going on in the world that there was, yes, rebellious. In the 70s, people were kind of coming out of that. The 80s were kind of a much better relaxed decade as far as coming out of stuff. The end of the Berlin Wall, and communism was being defeated in the 80s. And in the 90s had a little bit more rebellious with the grunge guys and stuff like that. But it's just like, what at that point, even there, there's this footage of like Eddie Vedder, and he's like after a show, he's like sitting down and he's like, yeah, man, I don't know what, I just do what I do. And he's like so tormented. And I'm like, why are you tormented? You're a musician in America. America's free. We got food, we got supermarkets, we got opportunity. You know what I mean? It was like, what? And so it's like today.
Want to make it big,
Right.
This is the place. This is the place, and exactly why would you want to, be down and downgrade like what you're doing, because you're here in the moment in the right country to do this, because this is the place. It's not a place, it's the place.
Right. And even Rage Against the Machine broke up because they really, what else are they raging against? It's like, I mean, obviously now there's a lot of stuff going on in the world that's obviously can outrage, is outrageous, but overall this is still the place to make it in. You know what I mean? And that to me is no reason to be so rebellious. I just find the rebellious thing just stupid now. I just find it dumb. And I'm like, just get out there and play music, and play good music. Don't suck. Just don't suck. You know what I mean? Because if you're rebellious and you suck, then that's really bad. But if you're rebellious and you're really good, then it's like, you don't need the rebellious part. You got the good. You got the goods. And I look at that for who was it that I was thinking about? I was thinking, I'm going off on this thing now, but I think it was what's her name? Nicki Minaj, Nick, whatever her name is. Who I think, if you hear her without all the other crap, I think she's actually good. You know what I mean? I think she's actually a good artist, and I see the talent there. But because there's this thing and I don't know if that's going to continue, but there's this thing that's there that I don't. I like actually J-Lo. You know why I like J-Lo? Because she is sexy. She's not the greatest singer. She's a good dancer. She's 50 now, for the love of God. She looks amazing. But my point is that she always kind of just took this herself as what she was. She was a superstar, but she wasn't so writing about dramatic, rebellious, fighting the system. Always. You know what I mean? It was just, she was J-Lo. She was just doing her thing. It's just like, why can't everybody just go out and do your thing? I'm gonna stop now.
That is exactly like the crux of rock and roll, and that entire culture. Like they were just trying to encourage going about life and writing about things that they saw, and you can say the same thing about other decades, but with amplification and driven guitars and raspy voices, and like starting to push the capabilities of, music and the technology that we had at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the rock and roll culture, pushing it, just seeing how far you can go, and speaking about life in a fun way. Fun. It's all about fun, having a good time.
And I think it also pushed people that
better time than Andres Ramirez right here. He is the man. So shout out to Andres and Tommy. Those pentatonic scales. You're one of the kings.
They call me Mr. Rock and Roll.
So, but I was gonna say that it also inspired people that might not have, that decided to become singers because of it. That if it hadn't been that, they probably wouldn't have become singers. If it hadn't been somebody that inspired them in rock and roll in the 50s, they wouldn't have become these singers in the 70s and the 80s. And I'm talking about artists that didn't have like the greatest chops as far as vocals, but had a great presentation, had a great message, had a great story. And I look at guys like, like earlier than like Dylan, and that's later actually. We'll talk about Dylan, of course, but
Dylan,
yeah,
King was in. Forgot about him.
Yeah.
Say it again.
BB King.
Oh, that's right. Oh my God. Yeah. Duh. And actually, a lot of all the Kings, Albert King,
and Francis Frank,
and Muddy Waters. Who else? I mean, all those guys.
Domino,
Buddy Guy.
Chubby Checker.
But Buddy Guy is huge in at that point as well. He's still playing actually, Buddy Guy. So for me, I think that it inspired those guys in the 60s that you probably would not have had the gall to go out and sing, but were so inspired by what happened in the 50s that they said, "I'm the hell with it. I'm going to go out and I'm going to do it." And there you have these guys. Of course, they're great singers as well, but I think it just brought out a lot of different energies and stuff.
The perfect example. Not to get ahead of ourselves, but I will give a preview for next week. Is what was going on in Merseyside, which is a place in Great Britain. I'm going to say a few band names. Some of them well known, some of them not. But one of them is a clue to next week if you are a huge fan of the Beatles.
I was gonna say you might be able to see the bass behind Andres, but I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, we got the Hoff, the good old Hoff. So we've got the teddy boy culture going on in good old England. In Liverpool, we've got the Quarrymen playing skiffle, and then somebody got an amplifier, and then they started playing some guitar-driven rock and roll from these artists like Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins.
And I wonder who they
Elvis Presley and Gene Vincent.
Eddie
Cochran. All these guys, Fats Domino, Little Richard. Thank you, Tommy. And then there's other bands looking to copy them, like Jerry and the Pacemakers and Rory Storm and the Hurricanes.
The pacemaker was invented in the 50s.
As a side note, Harry and the Senior.
Talk about perfect timing on that.
And there's also another band, not from the UK, but had a show that was inspired by the Beatles, but I'm not going to tell you yet. You got to tune in next week to find out.
Yes.
It's another one of my favorite bands.
The 60s, the Brits, they were the thing. They were the thing. But it wouldn't have happened if American music wasn't the thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If we didn't start rock and roll, they wouldn't have tried to copy us.
That's right.
And take it further than we did. But then we
USA,
responded.
baby.
But we're getting too far ahead with spoilers here. So we'll leave that for next week. We'll address some comments if you're able to on there, John.
I think next week's show is going to be really incredible because I think that's kind of the era that took what happened in the 50s and I don't want to say perfected it because what happened in the 50s was pretty perfect, but they kind of put another energy, another direction to it. You know, they put something else to it, another layer, you know, and I think that's when things were really kicking, and it's really when what we look at now that's happening out, you know, a lot of it came from what happened in the 60s because of what happened in the 50s. And that to me is really exciting. So I'm looking forward to next week's show. That's going to be definitely cool. So, what?
Oh, just discussing our closing. My bad.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're going to be closing up. So since you're whispering over there, why don't you give us whatever you're playing on the closing, and then I'll close it out.
All right. So Tommy's gonna play a little something, and then we'll respond with a little something. But
all right, go.
I would like to say thank you, John, for having us as always. This is a new format that we're trying out here. Not only the three of us trying this out on one screen, but John on the other end. I don't know if anybody knows this, but if you did follow his Facebook and Zuckerberg didn't censor his post, then you would know that his Verizon Fios was down and he's on his phone. So
it looks pretty good though. I mean, we got through it.
Yeah, this is a pretty experimental episode of Music Makers.
It is.
And as always, thank you, John. You can
pre-order
my autobiography, going to be released in 2064. It's going to be talking about all of our journeys, including the music makers, and putting it into the cultural zeitgeist. You can buy it anywhere that people sell things. And even if they're not people and they sell things, you know,
by then we're not going to have people.
You know, if robots sell things, you can buy
a little robot.
But I cannot wait to talk about the 60s because that is my favorite decade of music.
Hey, me too.
I like the 70s.
I mean, hey, 70s are cool
70s are cool too.
We got some good artists for the 70s,
but
not yet.
I like the 70s too.
If anybody's still around, you can email.
The 1870s.
Ah, you little trickster.
You can email johnhenrysoto@gmail.com, and we will hand deliver you
I don't even know if I can.
a cake from Judicki's with whatever message you want on it, socially distanced. If you don't have the Rona and you are not a minor and you are a girl, you are entitled to a free kiss on the cheek.
Oh boy.
So,
all right, let's just wrap.
Email johnhenrysoto@gmail.com. I thank whoever is still watching, and stay safe, stay healthy, and rock on. John, if you want to close up, we'll do our thing after you're done.
You want to say anything?
No, I'm actually always appreciate. I always appreciate the time with you guys, and it's always John Manuel is like 60s and 70s. Yeah, I agree. It's gonna be the next 2 weeks are gonna be a lot of fun. So no, but it's always grateful. I'm always very grateful for you guys, and it's always a lot of fun. I always learn a lot of stuff, so I appreciate it. And take us out.
All right. Play the lick and E, then we hit the E at the end. All right. Okay. Everybody's trying to do that.
Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. I will see you guys next week. And take care of yourselves. Have a great week ahead. And as always, I'm going to end off like this. So I don't even know how this thing goes. But anyway, I'm gonna end it off. And as always, peace.